Morning, everybody. Good morning, Monica.
Good morning, John. Good morning, everyone.
Well, welcome. Here we are, the day of infamy. It's it's the dawning of a new day today as we uh start day one under the new practice changes regarding the settlement. First, let me introduce myself. My name's John Breault, Vice President of MLS and Member Services. And with me today, Monica Staaf, General Counsel. Good morning again, Monica. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who is here this morning. We've done a number of these. And so for you folks that have attended the others, this may seem like old hat, but we really wanted to really more or less have an opportunity for you folks to ask questions, here being day one. And so we're going to leave a lot of time open for Q&A. I see we have a question in there already, which is great.
Yes.
And first, rules of the road as always. We will not be unmuting anyone, so don't raise your hands. Simply type your questions into the Q&A box, and we will read your questions as we move along. So, excellent. Did I forget anything, Monica?
Just how long we're going. The session is scheduled from 10 to 11, but John and I are available to hang out till 11:30. So we want to make sure we get your questions answered. And we each have just a few short updates, but then we're going to turn to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you. And let me apologize in advance. I'm a little under the weather today, so I'll be hitting my mute button and coughing
And
quite a bit.
coughing up a
So
lung.
I
Oh,
apologize for that. So don't make me laugh. That's when it really gets bad. So first, let's just start where we always start. We have a really abbreviated, just two slides. So what I want to do first is just summarize the major practice changes that will impact you and us as well as we move forward. First, the compensation being removed from the MLS. It had been our hope that the fields would be gone already, that as of midnight, the fields would be gone, but they are actually in there as of the last time I checked. They're still there. Our vendor told us that they'll be removing them sometime between 11 and 3 today. Obviously, they have to do this across multiple markets, and so they're going to just get to that when they get to that. So apologies if they are still there for now, but they will be removed at some point today. And that's for everything. So all statuses, all property types, off-market listings, you won't be able to do a search for sold listings and see what the compensation offered was. That will be hidden or removed. Likewise, if you're in the middle of a transaction on a pending agreement, that will be removed. So while it's there, I suggest that you print out a copy of the listing and make sure that you have that information, because if the listing was pending prior to today, then the listing brokerage still has to honor that offer of compensation. So you're still entitled to the offer of compensation as procuring cause for any transaction or any deal that was put together prior to today. So I want to make that clear. Again, all property types, this is across the board, residential, multifamily, land, commercial, etc. There can be no references anywhere in the listing to compensation, nothing in the remarks, no URLs that point specifically to your compensation policy, no document attachments that talk about your compensation policy. We really have got, this is, we have to take this seriously. We have to, police this vigilantly. So if we find it, it's coming out. Compensation fields obviously being gone will no longer be available in any data feeds as well. The other major change is the mandatory written agreements with buyers. Now, this, to clear confusion, this applies only to buyers touring homes. And so homes means residential property consisting of not less than one nor more than 4 residential dwelling units. So commercial, land, etc., not applicable. If you're dealing with a consumer who is looking to purchase a commercial property or a rental, or land. You would not be required to enter into a written agreement with the buyer. This is not mandatory buyer agency agreements. These are simply written agreements that cover really two things. A disclosure that says compensation is not fixed by law, and that it outlines what, if anything, you will be paid for your work on behalf of the buyer. Anything you want to add to any of that, Monica?
Just one question I know that our tech support team has gotten. What happens to the history?
Yeah, so the history, like I said, it's gone. I mean, there's no history of compensation at all in the MLS anymore. So we can't have any references to it at all. So there'll be no history of compensation. It will be as if it never existed in the MLS.
Thank you.
And let's just take a look to see. I know we have a couple of questions, so maybe we want to just
yeah, why don't I just do my quick updates first and then
all right.
Come on.
Okay. All right, that's fine. So let's do that. There we go.
They're very short. We only have 2 slides today. Thank you, Dread. Okay. One is just to let everyone know, as of this morning, the forms are the MLS forms and Rhode Island Association of Realtors forms are available live in .loop, Transaction Desk, Zip forms. Some of the smaller vendors, I'm not 100% sure that they've posted all the forms, but John, did you had an update on that, I think?
Yeah, I mean, so we'd licensed the forms to a lot of vendors, so there may be some that are still catching up, but the big ones have them, and most importantly, Transaction Desk being the one that we pay for all our customers to have free access to, has them available to you. So while they may not necessarily be integrated in a platform you're using yet, you can get to them through the Transaction Desk. And one thing I do want to point out as well, for those of you using Transaction Desk, we understand there was a technical issue with the purchase and sales agreement for the single families where data entered in one of the new sections, I think maybe it's 18, I don't remember, isn't being carried over. That's been reported, and we've received communications that they are working on that. So hopefully that will be straightened out soon.
Okay. Then the class notice. So some of you may have already heard from sellers related to a different settlement agreement, but former seller clients of yours may be starting to receive postcards relating to the settlement agreement anytime after August 17th. So between then and sometime in the fall. So if someone starts calling you up or texting you and says, hey, I got this postcard, what am I supposed to do? You really don't want to have to get into like answering a bunch of legal questions about the settlement agreement. We definitely would suggest that you just refer them. There'll be contact information, a website, a QR code on the postcard that will explain and is someone eligible for the lawsuit for part of the settlement agreement? What do they need to do? Who do they need to contact? What forms do they need to file? All of that. So it's all on that postcard, and I would just send them there. If you have any questions, John has actually put on this slide. We do have some resources. Some are ours and some are from the National Association of Realtors. So I've had some questions from people saying, well, how do I explain the lawsuit? This may get more attention than it has so far. And so those resources are all available. If you can see on your screen, rirealtors.org/CPR. And then finally, John had posted a bullet about co-broking. I think we have enough questions piling up in the Q&A that I think we're going to get to those through questions anyway. So John, unless you have anything you want to mention about that, I think we can skip that one.
Excellent. All right. Well,
Hey,
let's dig in. We said we'd leave a lot of time for Q&A. So if an agent is already under agreement with a signed P&S, is there any paperwork that needs to be completed for a listing for a buyer? So Monica, is there anything?
I'm shaking my head. No, no. Under those circumstances, I mean, for a listing broker, no, you wouldn't have to amend your listing contract.
I mean, I guess if the deal falls through, then you'd need
Yes.
to amend your, right? But as long as that deal moves
Exactly.
forward, you don't need to amend the P&S or have the buyer sign anything. It's sort of grandfathered in, right?
Right. And especially, John, like when you said about, if something falls through, that's, if you've been working with a buyer for a while and then this is just kicked into effect, if for some reason, even if they've signed a purchase and sales agreement, if that doesn't, maybe they drop out because of inspections or something like that. Yeah, you'd want to get them, if you don't do it right this second, going further down the road, you would want to have them sign a contract. But right now, no.
Excellent. An unagented buyer shows up. I love that, unagented buyer. That's nice, right?
Good word.
Yeah, it is. An unagented buyer shows up to my open house. Do they need to sign something before coming in? The answer is no.
No.
So if it's your listing, you do not have to have them sign anything. They can come in, and you're not working on behalf of the buyer. You're technically working on behalf of the seller. Or if you're, if you're maybe holding the open house for one of your co-workers, you're still technically working on behalf of the seller or the agent who represents the seller, and not on behalf of the buyer. Once you start working on behalf of that buyer, where you're going to perform duties such as, maybe writing up an offer or taking them into other homes, etc., then you would need to have them sign an agreement.
Perfect. Okay,
right.
and just how about this one? Just curious on the status of the new forms. I noticed that a lot of them still have watermarks.
Yeah, so they shouldn't. I mean, so the ones that we were linking to from the site, that was really as a convenience because the form providers didn't have them. We're going to be taking those down, actually. So you're going to have to go through, like you would have in the past, go through a forms provider. So the ones that are, again, available in .loop or Transaction Desk, etc., shouldn't have watermarks on them.
Yeah, and actually, just to add to your answer, John, I completely agree. I'm nodding. But this is sometimes I find, especially if someone might be a secondary member here, is understanding what forms come from which corporation. So all the listing contracts are multiple listing service forms, as are data forms. Anything like a purchase and sales agreement, an addendum, something like that, those are Rhode Island Association of Realtors forms. So if you can't get access to whatever platform you're using, just double check your membership status.
Right. What will happen if an agent does not comply with the new rules? So that really, because these are our MLS rules, there will be sanctions. It's up to the MLS to enforce these rules. And let's address that because one of the questions we get a lot is, I'm the listing broker. Do I have to verify that the buyer representative has a written agreement? Or does the buyer representative have to show me their agreement, etc.? You are under no obligation as a listing broker to verify that the buyer representative or the individual working with the buyer has fulfilled that obligation regarding the written agreement. That's not your problem, to be blunt. So you don't have to worry about it. And in fact, you have to allow them to show the property. You can't refuse to show your listing or let them show the listing because they're not proving that they have the agreement. That's really not your burden. It's our burden as the MLS. So what you could do is you would, make the property available to them, but you could, report to the MLS that, hey, gee, I don't think this individual has an agreement as they're supposed to, and it would be up to us to police that.
Right. And say other penalties in addition to MLS would be, frankly, if you're working with the buyer, you may not get paid. Now, some of you listening might be thinking, well, how's that different from now if I'm spending months with a buyer and don't have a contract with them? But in this one, there's really not going to be, the most part, there may not be another source for compensation. Like you're going to need your client's cooperation to get paid.
Right.
So
Well, that's right.
Financial penalty is a biggie.
Yeah, right. But previously, because MLS, compensation was in MLS, well, that's how you got paid, right? Now it's gone. So how are you going to get paid, right? That's an excellent point, Monica.
And finally, I have my moments, John. No,
Yeah, right.
But finally, just you also wouldn't be covered by the settlement agreement. That's a risk that you and your brokerage would run by not complying. So you think of all the you think of the nearly $5.4 billion with a B dollar judgment in the Missouri lawsuit. So you don't want to open yourself to things like that by not complying.
Right. Commercial rental searches. So just so I'm clear, will we need a rental agreement to show potential renting clients properties in person? No, you do not. It's single family, residential, 1, 2, 3, and 4 family. Right. So that's it.
Yes.
So rental searches would not require that.
I think what's maybe caused some confusion. Again, I'm nodding, absolutely agreeing with what John just, my head's gonna fall off by the end of this because I'm nodding so much. But I think what it caused some of the confusion, like specifically that requirement about having a buyer agreement before touring a property, that just limited to those properties that John mentioned. But as far as removing compensation from MLS, that applies to everybody across the board, commercial and rentals. So if you look at it, like I've used the analogy, maybe forgive the analogy, but kind of like dolphins in a tuna net. The plaintiff's attorneys are after brokers and salespeople who are working with sellers and buyers of 1 to 4 unit dwellings. But in order to just remove the compensation for those, they really had to remove it across the board. So even though commercial and rental folks aren't the ones who really are accused of any kind of wrongdoing, you're still caught in this, at least the removal of compensation. But you don't have to do the separate forms before showing the buyer property.
And so this question, what if the buyer agrees to the fee and then it comes to the closing and they don't have the money? Right? That's a big concern.
Yeah, we've been on John and I were on a panel discussion with, actually, I think we've been in a couple with closing attorneys. And I mean, as long as it's accounted for in the closing statement, it's certainly not ideal, but you could have the buyer put it on a credit card. You could have the buyer sign a payment plan. And this might be the part where you're kind of rolling your eyes thinking, oh boy, are we out of touch?
Yeah.
But those are options according to some closing attorneys.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I guess, I mean, the idea is this maybe it's a little more transactional now, right? So maybe we sort of should talk that through, like, how does this work in the transaction now, right? So let's say I'm on the listing side and I'm a broker and I have to decide, first of all, I guess, am I going to try to continue to charge compensation, collect it, and and share it in the way that I have previously? Or am I only going to worry about me and let the broker worry about themselves? And I guess the answer is there are a number of ways this can be done. And so I think that, so we've heard, and of course we can't, we're not endorsing any particular business practice or model, right? I mean, there are options, but I mean, it's hard to, we don't have to, actually, I was thinking about the going through the actual agreements where we talk through the language and that, but we're not sharing those today. So, but in some cases, the listing brokers are just, they're sort of collecting, what they're contemplating in their listing agreement is, look, this is what our fee is going to be. Then they're having the conversation with the seller that through the course of the transaction, the buyer may make a request of you in the form of concessions to cover the buyer's costs for things, including the cost for their agent. And then that would then be written into the transaction, I guess, in the purchase and sales, and then is covered that way, right? Through the disbursement of funds at closing.
Yes.
So I mean, so I guess the point is, if it's handled that way, and then it becomes, I guess, part of the financing, and the buyer, maybe it's less of a concern that once we get to the table now that, I'm going to go to the buyer directly and look to get a check and they don't have the money to pay me. Am I rambling? I told you I was under the weather a little bit, and I'm probably rambling a little.
It's okay. John has an ironclad excuse today. So if his head all of a sudden collapses on the table and you hear a thunk, you'll know he's really not feeling well today. Anyway, let's take a look. Oh, and just a quick reminder for any of you who joined us a couple of minutes into this, you just make sure to post your questions in the Q&A. We're not going to be able to unmute people. So if you're trying to raise a hand or something, please don't do that. Just type it into the Q&A. And then finally, just, I'm sorry for those of you who started right at 10, but just to let people know, we're scheduled from 10 to 11, but John and I we're willing to stay until 11:30 if we don't get through all the questions, because I know last time we definitely ran out of time. Okay, so back to the questions,
So
shall
maybe, so these next two questions are sort of related. I'm wondering maybe if I shouldn't just share my screen again, just to show the list of forms, because we have a question that says, is there a standard form that says commission is not set that we have to give buyers? And we do have a buyer, a form that we've created that you can use. And then the second question is, do you have a list of documents that have changed? So what I'm going to do now is just reshare my screen and show you all the forms that we've done.
Mhm.
There
And
we
John, while
go.
you're pulling that up, let me just say, we have a question about what the dates on the new forms be today. And no, the dates, you'll see the dates on the forms if you know you're using the right one. Bottom right-hand corner will say 6/24, because that's when the forms were sent to the vendor and the changes were approved. So it'll say 6/24, not 8/24.
Great.
Go ahead, John.
Well, so here you go. So here are your forms. And the forms really are in two libraries, I like to say. So they're the forms that are owned, that are RIAR forms. And then there are forms that are MLS forms. But just backing it up, we have the exclusive buyer representation agreement, which isn't a new agreement, but we've added the language that's compliant with the settlement, namely the disclosure, right, that compensation is not set by law, et cetera. And I don't know, Monica, were there other changes as well that of note that you want to mention for that or not?
No, I think that's the main one, since that was one of the questions is, if you're using all of the Rhode Island Association of Realtors and MLS forms that deal with compensation, have the mandatory language for the settlement agreement. If your brokerage decides to use its own forms, which you're certainly free to do, you just want to make sure that that language is in there. Compensation is not fixed by law and is fully negotiable. And you'll see that John had posted in an earlier slide, shared a link to our website, rirealtors.org/CPR. I guess we can drop that in the chat too. But if you want to go through this list of forms yourself separately, that's where it is all posted.
And so we have the buyer representation agreement, but then you sort of have the light versions of that, which at the bottom of the screen, there's there are two. It's the exclusive showing and compensation agreement and the non-exclusive showing and compensation agreement. So this is where you're not actually a buyer representative, but you're acting as a transaction facilitator on behalf of the buyer. So as I mentioned previously, the settlement isn't mandating buyer representation. It's mandating
You're fine.
just that there's a written agreement. So to that point, you could sort of do act as a facilitator. And so we've created these new forms at the bottom of the screen. Another new form, and we've get questions on this, and we might as well address this now, is the cooperating broker rental compensation agreement. It says tenants can use this form to request compensation for a cooperating broker from a landlord. So one of the questions we get, Monica, is like, how come there's a cooperating compensation agreement for rentals, but not for residential?
And the main thing for it's a good question. And for sales, there's already a new section 18 built into the purchase and sales agreement. So if the buyer is looking for compensation, it's there. With a lease, it doesn't really translate exactly. Like normally you wouldn't have that put into a lease. So the Forms Committee recommended creating a separate agreement for rentals to negotiate.
Okay, excellent. And so with the MLS forms, we modified the listing agreement so it takes out the cooperative compensation. And then there are just these two new amendment forms, and those are really, not related to the settlement, but just as opportunity arose, that while we were doing these forms changes, we periodically would be asked, hey, why not have an official amendment form that we can use if we're amending anything in the listing agreement. So you've created those as well.
Yep, there's a bunch. And by the way, John mentioned that there was a technical tweak on one of the forms that we discovered yesterday. If you see, I mean, with all the sheer volume of forms that were sent to the forms vendors at once, there are bound to be some little tweaks that are needed here and there. So if you have any questions about the content of the forms, please contact me. I'll take it up with the forms committee. We can send corrections to the vendors. I mean, I'd love to say everything is 100% perfect, but you know, I updated like what, more than 20 something forms at once in a short period of time. So not an
So,
excuse, just an explanation. So,
yeah. All right. So the
okay.
next question, really, I guess, directed at you since you mentioned this. If a brokerage wanted to accept credit cards as a form of payment from the buyer, is that something you advise we could, or you do not advise this?
I mean, you could really accept any form of payment as long as it's accounted for. I mean, you could you could have Venmo, you could do credit cards, you could have a check. I mean, anything like that. I think the main thing with, I don't know if the main thing is you could have a payment plan, whatever it might be. I think the main thing with a credit card is hopefully you're on good terms with the buyer because you don't want someone to suddenly like, say, oh, well, I have a dispute with my broker and I'm gonna dispute the charge with a credit card vendor. But a buyer, if a buyer wants to be a jerk, I mean, they could do that, but anyway, so that's just saying any option, heck, if you want to get a bag of gold from somebody as compensation, as long as they're crypto or something, as long as it's accounted for and your brokerage is willing to accept it, then that's okay.
Is there any, I mean, does it affect their ability to get financing or anything if they use a credit card or do a loan payment, or is that not a factor?
Well, all of that, I mean, and that's a good softball question, John. So thanks for asking that.
Oh,
Because no, but I mean, it's a good reminder for people to check with the buyer's lender upfront as early as possible in the transaction. Because there's lenders are on a learning curve, just as mortgage brokers, closing attorneys, us, the good people are paying close attention. A lot of people who are more dabblers or something may not be. So you just want to make sure that the lender's aware of any proposal that you have, and how is that going to affect the buyer's ability to get a loan, et cetera. So
so as
they're your
much as you
friends.
communicate with the
Yes.
lenders upfront, the better. Okay, so please let us know where and how you suggest we communicate any offered co-broke offerings when sellers choose to do so. Knowing they can't be an MLS at all, can we post in social media, etc.? So, so there's a couple, it's a sort of a layered answer to this question, right? I mean, the settlement doesn't prohibit the continued offer of compensation. And so, and I guess it's sort of when I was rambling earlier, I guess I was getting to a little bit about the complexity of trying to preserve that model. Because how do you, I mean, you can advertise on your website, you can advertise on your social media just for your listings. If you do wish to continue to offer cooperative compensation, you could. I mean, you don't, I guess, have to advertise it. You could have a conversation with your seller, right? Sort of, I guess, to what I was alluding to before, where the seller understands that they may be willing to offer to pay for it, but you don't necessarily have to advertise it. I guess it could just be handled again transactionally, as when there are inquiries that the seller is willing to offer something. At which point, I suppose the other broker is going to want to get some confirmation in writing, right, to solidify that. And that's where so do you start having agreements between brokers to handle that, or do you just have it, or one school of thought is that, look, the seller is willing to offer something, put it in the offer, right? So when your buyer puts in an offer, you put it in there as part of the offer, then it gets handled transactionally and it gets baked into the purchase and sales agreement, et cetera, versus sort of trying to figure out how to preserve this model of offering it and then brokers paying other brokers, which is what the DOJ really doesn't want to see anyway, instead of making it transactional. And it's like, look, it's taken, the seller is paying the fee directly as a concession, et cetera. Is that fair, Monica?
It is, and I would also say that speaking of the Department of Justice, right, they don't want to see any broker to broker compensation. They don't want to see even blanket offers of compensation from the seller. So you're really, and we've said this throughout these webinars that you might have attended before, but it's really a trade-off between what level of risk are you and your brokerage comfortable with versus what makes sense from a business perspective. And that's really, that's an individual brokerage determination. What I would say though is if you're representing a seller, one of the points that the Department of Justice and these plaintiffs' attorneys has made is when you're making a blanket offer of compensation, in other words, the seller or you are offering the same amount to any cooperating broker who comes along. That's the way the system has worked for many years. What they're saying is that, regardless, you could be dealing with a cooperating broker who's got 1 day of experience. You could be dealing with someone who's got, 10 or 30 years of experience who does an excellent job, or you could be dealing with a cooperating broker who just is a lousy person to work with. And yet you're offering the same across the board. And also before the seller even knows what the purchase and sales agreement is going to look like, what amounts are being offered, is a competitive situation, what are the terms and conditions? So the seller is similar to a buyer using an escalation addendum. The buyer, if the buyer doesn't, they could go much higher if they had to, but they don't want to. Why would they want to do that if they don't have to? So similar with the sellers, just keeping in mind, every seller is going to be different. You're going to have different conversations, but why does the seller want to commit a set amount up front? If maybe they don't have to, or maybe not that full amount. So, that's, a judgment call. That's a discussion for you and your brokerage to have.
One of the bits of advice we heard from a closing attorney was that, recommending that maybe everyone on this, webinar already does this, but talk about having net sheets, sheets with their sellers, where you've basically broken out the various fees, et cetera. And because let's face it, the sellers and the bottom line is like one of the primary concerns is their net, right? Like what are they walking away with? I mean, obviously there are other concerns about, time frames and, et cetera. But by and large, what's my net? And so when these things come in and they, like they talk about concessions or offering, it's like, well, would you be willing to offer this? Well, it depends. I mean, what's the offer look like? And that's where, put it in the offer, and then they can weigh that amongst other offers and see how it affects the net, and then, move forward that way. So it really gives the seller, I guess, more transparency and the ability to see how these terms affect their bottom line.
And I'd say too, whatever you decide to do, transparency is the key. So making sure that the seller absolutely understands and agrees whatever you and the seller decide to do with compensation. You don't want to have the seller agree to one amount and then anyway, just, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm talking
so we
too
sort
much.
of
I'm
answered
rambling
this
now.
question a little bit. Yeah, you're not sick though. You don't. Currently, compensation is broker to broker. To be compliant with NAR going forward, how will compensation to co-broke look like? So we sort of talked about that. I mean, the bottom line is, I mean, even let's say, I mean, we have the settlement, and let's fast forward 3 years, right? And let's say that the Department of Justice and these lawyers feel that commissions haven't gone down, right? Commissions are still too high. And then they're going to start looking at various things. And if you're still charging your commission, with the co-broke and splitting it that way versus making it transactional, are you, sort of setting yourself up for that liability that, look, you're preserving the higher commissions because you're collecting it and you're you're handling the co-broke that way, so it's an increased liability versus, handling it transactionally in the manner that we sort of referenced earlier. Is that?
Yep.
Good.
Sounds good.
All right. Do agents need to have their sellers sign a new listing agreement if the property is not under contract? So the answer, I mean, you have options, right, Monica? I mean, you can, right? Or you could amend the agreement. I mean, the bottom line is there's really, and this sort of, the next question is related to this as well, which is there a form that we have to give the sellers also saying commissions negotiable? The answer is yes. It's in the listing agreement, right? And so if you wanted to amend your listing agreement to include the new language
Mhm.
and remove references to compensation in MLS, you can do that, right? So you could amend yours, or you could have the seller sign a new listing agreement.
Yeah, you definitely want to remove any reference that the compensation is offered in MLS because it won't be accurate anymore.
Right.
And then, oh, here's a good one. I'm going to ask this one. All right. Ready, Jen? Dun,
Yeah,
dun,
go
dun.
ahead.
Okay, if I want to buy a home or land for myself, do I need a buyer agreement spelling out the fee I expect to receive?
That's a good question. I mean, the settlement doesn't, consider this, right? This isn't anything that's contemplated in any of the language I've seen, but I don't know, Monica, what do you think? Uh, are you a buyer representative if you're representing yourself? I mean, what hat are you wearing?
Yeah, I mean, part of it's going to be, are you signing, unless you're, if you're affiliated with the brokerage, are they going to have you buy through the brokerage? If so, I mean, you can do a contract through the brokerage if that's something that they would like you to do. Because if you are expecting to get compensation in that way. Another option could be that you're waiving a fee to make your offer more attractive. But if you're just buying it individually and your brokerage is my name, let's say my name's, well, I'll use my real name. How about that? My name is Monica Staaf and I'm Monica Staaf Brokerage. Yeah, I wouldn't sign a buyer's rep agreement, any kind of a buyer contract for that, even if I were looking for compensation.
So it
But if
depends
I
on
were
your
Monica,
licensure. I guess you're saying as the broker, you
yes,
wouldn't, but as an individual licensee, you would.
yes. And by the way, I keep seeing people raising hands. Sorry to be a pain about this, but if you've got your hand raised, we're not going to be able to unmute you. So please look for the Q&A button because we're going straight through all the questions in order here.
So here's one. If seller to buyer, then who issues the 1099? It wouldn't be a 1099, right? It would just be in the settlement statement. So I don't think there would be a 1099, right? Because we're not, is that correct?
Well, it would go through the closing attorney if the seller is paying the compensation to the buyer. All of that is part of what you want to discuss with the lender and the closing attorney.
Yeah.
As
Yeah,
early as
and that's a good point. So like to what we said earlier, this is where it's good to have conversations with the lenders, because one of the things we heard was recommended that instead of the seller paying the buyer, so the buyer can pay the buyer broker, have the seller pay the buyer broker directly. Now, why? I am not exactly sure. They sort of said why. I'm not a lender, so I don't know if I forget exactly the reasons, but this is why you want to have those kind of conversations with lenders ahead of time to understand what makes more sense in how these things are recorded.
Yes. Okay. Then we have, even if I'm covering an open house for the listing agent,
The answer is
that
no.
goes back to signing the forms.
Yeah, you don't have to have it signed. If you're covering an open house for the listing agent, then you're not required to have the buyer sign one of those agreements.
Yep.
What if the buyer decides to offer through you unrepresented, but I work for the seller? I'd say it's the same thing. I mean, if you're not, if they're simply just giving you an offer, you're still a representative of the seller, you're not representing the buyer, then I would say you don't need to have that form signed. Now you could, I mean, there's no, I suppose, just spelling out that, I guess that you don't represent them, or, but it's not required.
And I'd say that key to that one too is the way the question was asked, unrepresented. Because if it were a buyer, sometimes people practice what I call instant dual facilitation, which you don't want to do. That'd be if you were working with a buyer and had a buyer contract with them, then you're separately working with the seller and have a listing contract with them. That buyer's becomes interested in that seller's property. That's the only time that only if your brokerage authorizes it and the buyer and seller agree, that would be like, you'd be a dual facilitator. And in both cases, you're going to have written contracts with them unless you refer them to someone else. But just mention the difference between represented versus unrepresented. Okay, I'm rambling again. Let's move on.
That's good. We have a hypothetical here. I have worked with a buyer for 6 months, showed a property they liked prior to August 17th. Now I'm going to say August 14th because the 17th was the date NAR said was the deadline. Our date is today, which is the 14th. So I'm going to reread this, but with the 14th substituted.
Mhm.
So I've worked with the buyer for 6 months, showed a property they liked prior to August 14th. They asked to see it post August 14th. They will not sign a buyer contract. They go to another broker or buy the house on their own. The question is, am I due compensation due to procuring cause? I mean, I guess you could certainly file for arbitration, but I'm not an expert on procuring cause. I mean, if you didn't show the property before, I mean, the question, did you introduce them to the property?
It
Well, you
looks like
said
they did,
showed a
though.
property they liked.
They did introduce them, it looks like. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I guess the answer is you have the right to file for arbitration, and ultimately the hearing panel would have to decide if you were procuring cause, and then you would be. If they said yes, then technically, if it was prior to August 14th, you would be entitled to compensation.
yeah, I would print out that, make sure that you keep track before the compensation fields are removed.
Right.
Probably within the next hour or several hours, right, John?
Yeah.
So, yeah, but yeah, you definitely you'd have to file an arbitration request unless you could work something out with the listing broker.
Does an active listing for land or a condo need a listing signed by seller? A new listing? Oh yeah. Well, we kind of covered that already, right? Regardless of property
Mhm.
type, you can amend the listing. You have to first address the language that's references compensation in MLS because that's gone. So you at a minimum have to amend that. And you should probably also get them to sign off on that new required language about, compensation is negotiable, et cetera.
Oh, I see what he's asking because it's the land, because the condo. No, that's still covered under the settlement agreement. The condo,
Yep.
it's still a unit.
Right.
Okay. Never mind.
Yeah, because we're talking on the listing side. We're not talking buyer agreement
Yes.
side, right? That's where it gets
Yep,
confusing.
you are correct. All right.
Purchase and sale is currently being negotiated with the seller and buyer's attorneys on a land sale. This is it's like Sunday school where they ask, would that be a sin, Father? If I, right when they start going through the scenarios here. So the P&S is currently being negotiated with the seller and buyer's attorneys on a land sale. MLS had compensation stated. Do we need to have a separate compensation agreement signed?
I mean, oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Monica.
I was gonna say, I mean, it wouldn't hurt to, I would say just to protect yourself if you're on the buy side, I'd print out the compensation before it disappears. And then also I'd email or do some kind of paper trail. I know people do a lot of texting. I'm not a super fan as if you're trying to keep something as a permanent record. I mean, nothing wrong with texting, but anyway, you want to have some kind of, just to protect yourself, get some kind of written confirmation, like, hey, you're offering compensation of X amount. If this purchase and sales agreement comes together, I'm still expecting compensation of X amount, something like that. Or, another option is you could just build it into the purchase and sales agreement itself. And rather than having the compensation come from the listing broker, have it come from the seller.
Right. Okay, I understand no agreement is needed at an open house, but if a buyer contacts a listing broker directly to view the property, is it correct that the listing agent does not have to use a contract to show them a home? Correct. They do not. It's your listing. If they contact you, that's a great question because we've been just talking about open houses. But if they contact you to see one of your listings, you do not have to have them sign a buyer agreement because you are not acting on behalf of the buyer. You're acting on behalf of the seller.
Right. Yeah. If you're exclusively working on behalf of the seller, then no agreement.
What is the best way for listing agents to communicate to buyers agents what professional service fee is being offered? I mean, we sort of, I mean, I mean, don't is one answer, right? I mean, but it kind of goes back to whether or not you should still be collecting that fee or just having it come out, and have the seller paying it versus you paying it. But I assume this means that the broker is paying the fee, right? So what's the best way for listing agents to communicate to buyer what service is being offered? I guess it's by whom, right?
Right. By the seller, by the listing broker, is it negotiable? And John, I know we had a question the other day. I'm trying to think it was this week or last week, but we're going to borrow this Realtor's suggestion, which was the person said, can I say something like the seller is willing to entertain requests for compensation to cooperating brokers? And that way I kind of like that entertain language because they're not committing the seller to a set amount, although I know it's frustrating on the buy side, but they're not committing the seller to a set amount. They're just saying, yeah, put it in the purchase and sales agreement. Let's talk.
Yeah, I mean, basically it's the seller is willing to consider all offers, right? So put it in the offer and
Yep.
the seller will consider it. That's the real, there can't be any references to compensation in the MLS. So that wouldn't be language we'd allow in the MLS, right? The compensation part, but they could say sellers are willing to entertain all offers, right? Which they are anyway, right? So, I mean,
Yep.
yeah, but, good. My broker does not provide forms or a paperless transaction, pay for them on my own. I cannot stand transaction desks. So where will I locate these forms for download?
I don't
I
know
mean, the
that.
thing is, right now, it's as always that you don't have to you can download them from transaction desk. That's where you'll get them. You don't have to use transaction desk, but you can go in and get them from transaction desk. That's the platform because we don't make them publicly available. I mean, we did with the watermark because we were trying to protect our copyright, but they're not normally just available for anybody on our website. You have to go through a forms platform. That way we verify that they're for members only. So you log in you go to transaction desk, you download them there, and then you can use them wherever you want to use them.
Okay.
I'll let you read, Monica.
Okay. Can you clarify what it means to stipulate a definitive professional services fee in a buyer representation agreement? Please provide examples of language that would not be acceptable. Well, I can start us off here if you want. And so something that would be acceptable, you're saying the buyer agrees to pay you, or your brokerage, I mean, a specific dollar amount, a specific percentage of the gross or net of the transaction, an hourly rate, a flat fee, whatever it might be, something specific like that. Examples of language, and John, feel free to chime in, but examples of language that would not be acceptable under the settlement agreement would be that the buyer, that the cooperating broker would be paid whatever the listing broker or seller offers. Or
Right.
it would not be acceptable to have a range. It's like, I'll take anything from $1 to whatever amount. It has to be something that's, I think the language in the settlement agreement was objectively ascertainable. How do you like
Right.
those for buzzwords? But yeah, so anything that's open-ended like that. And on that topic, I just want to say some people have asked, and it might even be in the question field later on too, but some people have asked, well, all right, what if I agreed to a set amount? And by the way, since we've got people here from different brokerages, I would appreciate you're not using actual numbers or percentages, just so we can keep all of ourselves out of hot water. But at any rate, so someone has said, like, okay, let's say the buyer agrees, we sign a buyer contract, the buyer agrees to pay me X, but the seller or listing broker is offering Y amount, which is higher than that. So can I accept that? Can I accept Y as compensation instead of X? So, and the
Okay.
answer is no. You can't accept, you have to accept it has to match what's in the buyer representation agreement. So to make any kind of changes, actually, I did get some feedback after our last presentation that I think I'll blame it on myself. I may have caused a little confusion here. Can you amend the buyer representation or any kind of buyer contract to get a higher amount than the amount that was originally agreed? I say in general, I mean, you can amend the contract if the buyer agrees, but what are you doing that's different for the buyer? Has something changed about the transaction to justify the higher amount? Are you providing additional services? Has the transaction become more complicated? Because the equivalent, and I hope I don't offend anyone with this analogy, but I'll use it anyway. It's kind of like if you go to a sandwich place and you've got a tip jar at the counter, or the person who's ringing you out has on a screen like, okay, check the amount that you want to tip the person who's standing right in front of you. I don't know about you, I find that a little awkward. And so you don't want buyers to feel pressured. If a buyer spontaneously says, "Whoa, you're doing such a fantastic job. How can I give you a bonus?" That's different from saying, "Oh, the seller wants to offer more, so sign here."
Yeah. I mean, we've heard it said that, there are certain consumer agencies that feel that in those situations where maybe the seller is offering more, is that the option should be, you go to the buyer. I mean, it's not the option. That's what you should do, is go to the buyer and ask them, gee, they're willing to offer more. What would you like to do? Would you like to reduce the price of the home by that amount? Would you like that amount, Mr. or Mrs. Buyer? Or, like you said, I guess, would you like me to have that amount? Right. So
Yes.
those are essentially your options. Okay.
Great. Oh my gosh, these questions they're like multiplying.
Yeah, we got
Like 63 questions in the
pedal to
queue.
the metal here. Okay, so if a listing is incomplete, will the form change automatically? It should. But that may be something that is a little technical snafu, where if you have a value filled into the compensation fields, when that goes away and you go to make the listing live, it may give you an error. So you would simply have to just remove that information from those fields, but those fields should just go away.
And by
If
the
a
way,
seller,
oh, go ahead.
oh, go ahead, Monica.
I was just gonna say, for any of you who have to leave, since we did market this for 11, it's still a few minutes till. John and I have said previously, we'll hang out till 11:30. We'll record that part of the Q&A as well. So if you need to go, and you won't miss anything, except for our live stimulating personalities.
Oh my
No,
God.
just kidding. Anyway,
Okay.
okay, moving on there.
If a seller agrees to offer compensation to a co-broke, where do we add that in the listing agreement? Would that go into section 7, additional professional service fee provisions? I think the answer is yes
Yes.
to that. If I have a listing that is active now or coming soon and not under contract, do I need to do an amendment to the exclusive listing agreement? I mean, we sort of covered that, but the answer is yes.
Yes. And by the way, separate from this, if you have any questions about the forms or you have a specific situation that we don't get to today, please feel free, like I said, to contact me if you have questions about the content of the form or what goes in the forms. And then John oversees the technical team, so if we have any issues there, he can get you to the right person. Okay.
If I have a property listed and established a compensation for broker and co-broke, no offers yet, am I obligated to the original compensation? I mean, the answer is no, because that's going away. I mean, unless like in that scenario that came up before, where somehow somebody can argue they were procuring cause because they showed the buyer the home. Remember that hypothetical that came up
Yes.
earlier? So it could be that, I guess if it's been shown, right, somebody, that buyer then decides to buy it, you may be obligated.
Yeah, although the person can change. Right, so if I were the listing broker in that scenario that we're talking about before, I'm really gonna stir things up here, but in the MLS, at least in the current, for a little while longer MLS rules, the listing broker can unilaterally change compensation to a
Right, that's
property
true.
broker
So you
until
could
the
say we're
offer
no
is
longer
presented.
offering compensation. I guess the question is, where do you put notice of that, right? Because there's no longer a field in MLS. So you'd have to just, I guess communicate that when somebody comes forward to see it again, that, that there's no longer compensation offered, if you wanted to go that route.
Yes. Okay, how about this one? If a buyer wants to see a house but will not offer any compensation, are we obligated to show?
I would
John?
say yes, right? I mean, if you're acting as their fiduciary, right? I mean, you tell me. I mean, you have to, I mean, I guess it depends on what's in your agreement, first of all, right? Are you agreeing to work for free, or are you agreed to work for a price? Go ahead, Monica, you're the lawyer. I'll let you answer this.
Yeah, no, you're doing great. I mean, no, I agree with you. I think what I would do in that scenario is just remind the buyer, like, hey, this one, and the other thing too, is you don't know for sure that on a lot of these up front, you're not going to know if there is compensation offered. Because everyone's going to be kind of all over the map trying to adjust to these changing rules. So, I mean, we've already seen, even before all these changes went into effect, starting last year, some of the listings in MLS would either offer zero compensation or maybe $1 or something like that. And they'd advise people, put it in the purchase and sales agreement. We'll take it to the seller. So I would just walk the buyer through the different options and just kind of remind them, like, because it should be their choice if they still want to see the property. And you don't want to kind of withhold information about the property from the buyer. On the other hand, no one has to work for free if you don't want to. So it's how do you finesse that with the buyer?
Can I include in the buyer's agreement that the buyer will ask compensation to be paid by seller?
I think that's already in the new buyer representation agreement and the showing in compensation agreement that they authorize, I mean, the buyer, because you're still having the buyer agree to a set amount or percentage or dollar amount, whatever it might be. But then you're also authorizing them to, they're also agreeing that they'll cooperate with you in asking the seller for the compensation. So take a look at those new agreements if you haven't had a chance to yet.
Would, this is yours, would dual agency forms be written differently? Would agents need to have listing agreements and buyer agreements?
Yes. Yep, they would definitely need both first, and then only if that buyer and that seller get together. So you're not going to see, I know sometimes people have done this at open houses where some random buyer walks in and all of a sudden they're trying to sign them up as a dual facilitator. And that really was never something that was workable under the vast majority of scenarios. But yeah, you definitely would need to have a contract in place with both of those if you're trying to get them, if you're trying to represent each one of them and then they want to get together.
Is a touring agreement acceptable? I mean, I guess the question, it depends on what's in your touring agreement, but to be compliant with the settlement, there are just two sentences you need to have in there. One that addresses that compensation is not fixed by law or et cetera, whatever that specific language is. And then the second is, what you're going to be paid. And so anything beyond that is up to you, right? So your agreement can be very lean and just really contain those two particular things in terms of the settlement. I mean, obviously you want to be clear with the buyer as what they're getting for their fee, right? So it makes sense to put in there what services you're providing. Follow up on the commercial rental search question. It would most likely be a best practice to have some sort of agreement with potential renter in hand to ensure we would receive compensation for helping renters find a commercial property, correct? Sure. I mean, just because you don't have to doesn't mean you shouldn't or you couldn't under, but it's just not required as part of the settlement.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if you want to get paid, there's no substitute for having a written contract.
I'll let you read it.
John, I think you covered this next one, but I'll ask the question. I think you already covered it. Residential rental. Can the tenant request that the landlord pays for compensation? Is there a form for that? And you just showed that on your list a couple of minutes ago.
Yeah, there's a form for that. Yep.
And now I just forgot the name of it. Is it a rental compensation?
Is it the?
Oh, geez, I just forgot the name of it.
Hold on. I've got
okay.
I've got on my
I'll stall while you're looking it up.
Hold on. It's the
rental
cooperating broker rental compensation agreement.
Okay.
Rolls right off the tongue.
It does. We need an acronym for that. This is bad if I don't remember the names of the forms. Okay. All right.
Go ahead. I'll let you read for a few.
Okay, sure. Yeah, give you a little break. What is a good way to explain to sellers at a listing appointment how this will work? Because I'd like to get the seller to agree to let me compensate buyer's agents. I'm probably the wrong one to ask for that one because I don't know that listing brokers offering compensation to cooperating brokers is the wisest move from a legal perspective, even though the settlement agreement does allow it. So I don't know if I can really make a good case for doing it that way instead of having the seller offer compensation. John, you want to take it?
So we added language to the listing agreement that talks about, so, the modified listing agreement, you have what you're going to be paid. You have sort of this blank, other professional services fee, but then we have the section in there that talks about through the course of the transaction that, a buyer may ask for a fee or something along those lines, and that has to be done in writing. So, I mean, so maybe the way it is to sort of, it's about setting the expectation, I guess, with the seller, and that you're saying, look, this is what you're going to pay me for my services. there's been a shift in the market, I guess, right? And that now, buyers are paying for their own brokers where previously they haven't, and that some buyers, may not have the funds to handle that, or they may make a request of us or of you to work that into as part of the transaction by way of a concession, etc. And so it's about setting that expectation that as offers come in, part of that may include these contingencies that a fee will be paid to the cooperating broker. And so it's right. And then the seller, again, as we talked about earlier, can evaluate those offers and that fee, among all the contingencies, just like any contingency, right? It's like, okay, well, I have to pay X and they're offering Y, and and it'll close and whatever, and they're waiving inspections or whatever the things that are. And then they can evaluate all of those things as part of the offer.
A lot of that's, market conditions too.
Right.
What are you seeing in the market? Are you seeing, 40 multiple offers the way we did right out of COVID? Are you seeing a slowdown? That'll make a difference too.
Because one of the challenges now, I don't want to say challenges, let me rephrase that. I mean, previously, you with the old agreements, you charged blank, and then you were telling the seller that, of blank, Y would be paid to a cooperating broker, right? Now, the framing is a little bit different because you're charging blank, but well, what if you bring the buyer, right? Are you, the so-called double ending it, right? How does that conversation now work in context of this new thing where they're like, well, wait a minute, you're working for me, and now you're representing the buyer, and you're collecting more, but if you bring the buyer, do I get that back, or do I get, these are conversations I guess historically you've had anyway, but they may become they may be a little more in the forefront now because how this, the forms are written and how the settlement, that's sort of how the things are settling, not to use the word settled, but settling now with the settlement. So it just may make things a little more nuanced, I guess, in your conversations.
And just one quick thing before we go to the next question, but in the listing contract, I did give a presentation to a brokerage yesterday. And one of the issues that came up was when you're putting compensation, in general, I think people are used to putting total compensation in the listing broker, like thinking, okay, this is listing broker compensation. This covers a cooperating broker as well. Well, you may find that some of your competitors are focusing on the listing portion only, that that's the only thing that's going into the listing contract. So that's something to consider too. If you're trying to keep what we in the past might have been considered a full commission in the listing contract, and it looks like someone else is charging less than you, that may be a question you want to anticipate discussing with the seller.
Okay.
Should we do this
so,
next? Do you want to read this one down, or do you?
Yeah, I think these next three I can. So we can still ask the seller to compensate the buyer broker as part of the offer, though, can't we? The answer is yes.
Yep, it's in both the letter of intent and the purchase and sales agreement. You'll see a separate section that can be filled out to do exactly that.
Wouldn't the buyer arrange to have their compensation paid in the settlement statement? They would offer the price of the property to include compensation to buyers, right? Yes.
Yep, and talk to the mortgage broker, lender, closing attorney, all of them.
Can we show buyer agent compensation on commercial sites like LoopNet? So LoopNet, yes. I mean, LoopNet is not subject to the settlement, right? So they can continue to publish compensation on sites like LoopNet. However, sites that receive listing data from the MLS. Now, one of the conditions with the MLS is that in addition to removing compensation, we can't facilitate mechanisms to continue the offer of cooperative compensation. And so under that, MLS can't feed listings to commercial sites that contain, or to any site that has offers of compensation. We don't feed listings to LoopNet, but for example, Crexy is another commercial site, and we do have listings fed to Crexy. So if Crexy were publishing cooperative compensation, we would have to we would pull their feed. They wouldn't be entitled to feed of listings anymore.
And also just with LoopNet, I mean, I don't even know, do they let you list by, I mean, are you, I guess I'm wondering if the person is asking about commercial property, or if they mean, can we put compensation for a residential transaction to LoopNet?
I assume it's just commercial. I don't
That's
think
what I'm
LoopNet
assuming
has
too, but
residential. And I don't know in
never
the
know.
commercial market if they even do that anyway, right? They sort of handle things differently anyway, right?
I
Actually,
can
sort of,
grab this.
go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I'll let you speak.
Okay, it's a short one. Is there an example somewhere showing the wording on the buyer rep form that we should be using to make sure that we receive compensation? Yeah, if you look at, Ryer has the exclusive buyer representation agreement,
Do you want me to
section
grab
9.
that form and share it, Monica, or no?
If you want to, sure. It's section 9 of the exclusive buyer representation agreement. I forget the section number for the other two options of forms. So that will have the wording, your agreement with, between you, your brokerage and the buyer. And that spells out all of that. And then
Hold
in the
on.
list, in the purchase and sales agreements themselves, it's section 18 for the single family purchase and sales agreement. So it's going to be section 18. Some of the other ones might have slightly different numbering, but yeah, those are built into the form. It's just a question of what you fill out and what you agree to.
All right,
So
so this is the buyer rep agreement. Of course,
yeah, so section 9.
I'm trying to zoom in, but I can't. There we go. There we go.
Well, that's okay. Yeah.
There we go. Section 9. So
Yeah.
first and foremost, you get that bolded section. Compensation is not set by law and it's fully negotiable, right?
Mhm.
Short and sweet. That's the required
Yes.
language right there, right?
Yep. And then in A, you'll see like Roman 9A, Roman numeral 1, 2, 3. Just below the 3, you'll see buyer authorizes brokerage firm to collect the fee from the seller or other parties as part of the purchase and sales agreement or other written agreement. So that's there. And that's the language in the buyer contract. And then the purchase and sales agreement has a whole section for negotiation. So,
All right. I'm not
okay,
sure.
where are
We'll
we?
skip that for now.
John, I think this one's for you about, are people gonna get hit with fines? I'll ask you, put you on the hot
Yeah,
seat.
I mean,
Well, let's read the question first, because I haven't seen it yet.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Okay,
Go ahead.
for honest mistakes with any of this, are we gonna be hit with fines automatically? Or will we get a phone call or email to fix something before being charged a fine? I imagine there's going to be a learning period and some
Yeah, I
confusion
mean, we don't
first.
typically, my philosophy anyway is it's not about just collecting fines and, nailing people with fines. It's about educating people and giving them an opportunity to correct things, especially when you have new rules like this. But as I said earlier, though, we have to take it seriously because there's liability to the MLS if we allow the publishing of compensation. So we'll need to get things corrected quickly. But if somebody obviously is a repeat offender, then they will feel the full weight of the law in
Ooh, the
terms of
full fury of MLS.
Yeah, right.
But definitely, it's not a get rich quick scheme for MLS, and definitely erring on the education side.
Right.
Okay, then we have, are we still using the mandatory real estate relationship disclosure for sales and rental transactions, or has that been replaced? Yep, you're still using that form because that's a state law, Rhode Island law. And then the settlement agreement is what gets you into having a written contract in addition to that.
In the P&S, is it allowable to state the sales price with an amount to be paid to the buyer broker? So the commission amount will be included in the sales price, seller getting less that amount.
That's going to be one of those discussed with the lender, because you're also going to have potentially appraisal issues. So anything how you want to structure that, have the buyer. Oh, and actually, I just remembered something. After our last webinar, one of the realtors listening said, make sure to just let people know when Don or I says, talk to the lender, talk to the closing attorney, talk to a mortgage broker. It is with the buyer's permission. So you don't want to just kind of go behind the buyer's back. Make sure that the buyer is authorized you to do that. Okay. Why wasn't, let's see, what's this one? John, I'm not sure what this
So yeah, why wasn't anything added to the exclusive right to sell agreement where the seller agrees to
Oh.
compensate a buyer's agent? Massachusetts allows for that. The lack thereof is making us offer zero compensation at our office in Rhode Island because we don't want to create legalese on the contract. Thoughts? Well, yeah, it was on there and we deliberately took it out. I mean, because of the settlement. I mean, there are some MLSs that are continuing, or some states, I guess, or associations with their forms that are continuing to have cooperative compensation on the listing agreement. And in some cases, I think in California, there was an issue where, they got in trouble for that. And so it's I guess about risk tolerance. And our position is that if MLS is essentially out of the compensation business, and these lawsuits are about artificially, no, again, I'm not saying if we agree with this or not, but this is what the result is. That the lawsuit was about artificially inflated compensation because MLS requires the offer of cooperative compensation, right? So why would then MLS want to have language in their form, being that we're out of the compensation business? Why would we want to have language on our MLS official form that seems to promote or encourage the continued, offer of cooperative compensation, thereby continuing to inflate compensation to sellers? And so we made the decision that it shouldn't be standard language in our agreement. There's a place where you can put it in, that's section 17, I think it is, or the other professional services fees, but it shouldn't be standard language in the MLS form if the MLS is out of the compensation business.
The other thing to keep in mind too is MLS PIN is not part of this settlement agreement. MLS PIN was separately sued in a class action lawsuit. And so they've been negotiating a different settlement agreement. Basically, they've gone through multiple versions for almost a year now. Their settlement agreement hasn't been approved by the court, while the NAR one has at least gotten preliminary approval. The reason I mention that is MLS PIN decided, obviously we don't speak for them because we don't work for them, but from what we've read, MLS PIN decided to go ahead with the settlement agreement anyway. And so I know one of the proposals was to let the sellers make offers of compensation in MLS PIN itself. But even that, keep in mind, one of the settlement proposals was the seller could change their mind. If they didn't get a full price offer, they could change their mind what they wanted to offer. So, and then we also saw, when John mentioned California, one of the larger MLSs in California initially started off having concession fields. And some of their MLS participants discovered, like, wow, all these concession fields were somehow coincidentally coming up to the exact percentages that people used to offer for compensation to cooperating brokers. So the long story short, which is probably too late because I made it long, but MLS PIN is part of a different settlement agreement than statewide MLS is. And like I said, theirs hasn't been approved by any court yet. At least ours has gotten preliminary approval. So see what happens.
Yep.
I know it's challenging for people who are licensed in multiple states. Just trying to figure out how do we make this work across the board. But the person who said that about their office policy, what they're doing in Rhode Island, yeah, I mean that's a safe approach. It may not be what you ideally want to do from a business perspective, but that's a safe approach, and just letting people know, put it in the letter of intent, put it in the purchase and sales agreement.
Okay, this next one, as a listing agent, if you have an agreement off the MLS, does the closing attorney separate it and disperse the buyer broker compensation as is done now at the closing? I'm not sure I understand the question, honestly.
Maybe if it's a non-MLS listing,
You have a non-MLS.
then does the closing, so basically how's the money, if there's a non-MLS listing and there's a cooperating broker involved, how is that dispersed? But then will there be a cooperating broker involved if it's from a different brokerage, if it's a non-MLS?
I don't know. I mean, I guess it would be dispersed the way it is in any transaction, right? That's right. I mean, I don't think it's handled differently at the closing versus if it's in or out of the MLS or whatever. It's handled all the same way, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would think that I think that's a change that I know in some parts of the state it's been common for years for the closing attorney to disperse to both the listing broker and cooperating broker, where other parts of the state it's been common to give disperse to the listing broker, and the listing broker pays the cooperating broker and issues a 1099. I think you're going to see a lot more of just, in fact, if not exclusively, just funds dispersed separately if there's a cooperating broker and listing broker in the same transaction. So,
if a seller is open to paying a buyer brokerage fee, but is not specifying in advance what the amount is, can we use wording in the listing contract as a form of authorization from the seller to inform buyer brokers of their willingness to consider paying this fee? What would that wording look like? I mean, I guess the question is, you're getting somehow some advance authorization of their willingness to, I mean, do you really need to get that in the contract? Like your seller saying, yeah, I might be willing to pay. It kind of goes back to, well, they'll put it in their offer, and then they'll evaluate the offer, and then they'll decide then. But so I guess the question is, though, is there some language that you'd want to put in your agreement that sort of codifies the seller's willingness to consider it? What do you think?
I mean, you could just put, and I understand the need for, like, why people feel there's a need for it, because especially in the start, I'm sure listing brokers will be getting a lot of calls from cooperating brokers saying, like, is there compensation with this? How is this going to work? All of that. I mean, you could certainly have something just generic that that the seller is willing to offer compensation, or willing to either pay compensation to a cooperating broker, or willing to entertain requests for compensation from a cooperating broker. I know I rattled it off quickly. It doesn't really do a lot, but if it gives you more security as a listing broker to say the sellers agree, the seller hasn't just said, hell no, there's no way.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have that conversation, right? First of all, that's, again, sort of going back to something we talked about earlier. You want to have the conversation with the seller and set that expectation that there may be requests, and get their feeling. But and it sort of goes back to what the concession fields as well. Like, is your seller willing to, offer concessions? Well, it depends. I mean, it all depends on what the offer is, right? I don't know. I mean, I'm willing, depending on what it is, they're offering and where we're at. And that's where that net sheet really comes into play. A big part of it is like, because the seller could say, no, I'm not willing to, no, I'm not paying the buyer broker at all. I'm not willing to pay for somebody who's working against me, and da-da-da-da-da. But then the offer comes in that, I'm going to just make up some ridiculous number, at $100,000 over asking price, right? Then they're like, well, all right, I don't care then. Like, sure. So I think part of it is just having that conversation, then setting the expectation, and then negotiating. What's the advice about getting a retainer? So I think that must be on the buy side, maybe. And so, I mean, I'll let you.
Nothing stops it on the listing side either,
I guess, and this, so, I'll let you speak to this, but I mean, one of the things on the buy side, you may see a different, on the listing side there, you've seen menus of services, and back when entry only listings first came out, there were just levels of services being offered to sellers. And there's nothing to stop that from happening on the buy side as well, where you're entering into agreements with buyers that are, I'll provide X, I'll do this for this, but if you want me to do all these other things, then it'll cost you this much more, or whatever, or I guess charge a retainer, right? And handle it that way as well, right?
Yes. And I have been getting a fair amount of questions about retainers lately on the buy side. So part of it is some people have said, all right, let's say it's, you can have a refundable retainer, you can have a non-refundable retainer. But people saying, like, all right, let's say it were a non-refundable retainer that I'm charging to the buyer, do I get the money, or does it go to the brokerage? Goes to the brokerage. So I hope all the brokers here appreciate my saying that, because that is true, right? You don't just go off and like spend it and have them write you a check for a retainer. The check would be, or check, boy, I'm getting old. Okay, however the compensation is being delivered, it'd be made payable to the listing brokerage. And then if it's refundable, the listing brokerage would hold it in an escrow account, or whoever's holding the escrow funds would hold it. If it's non-refundable, they could they could pay you your, whatever your split is, right, as soon as the funds clear. So,
Okay, in a scenario here, let's see, buyer signs an exclusive buyer rep agreement at X%, and the seller offers less than that, and the buyer won't or can't pay the buyer's rep, agree to lower the fee. All right. All right, but basically the buyer can't pay the amount. So does the buyer rep have to agree to lower the fee, or does the buyer broker have to approve that? I think I saw in your language in the buyer rep agreement that if the buyer is responsible for paying the difference, right? If
they are. I mean, a lot of it's kind of like if you've ever been a listing broker and had pressure to reduce your compensation. Not saying you ever have to do that. If you chose to do it from a business perspective, you could. I think the issue here is probably more of an office policy issue. Does your brokerage have a policy that allows, are you telling everyone who is affiliated with your brokerage, this is what we want you to charge? Any variation needs broker approval or team leader approval, manager approval, or you're authorized to make those changes on your own. So principal brokers and managing brokers, I would look at whatever your internal policy is and make sure to communicate that to your licensees.
as a facilitator, are you able to get paid? The answer is yes, right?
Yes.
How do you handle listing broker compensation that varies when there is a buyer's agent? And why does it seem that all is up in the air? And what are the penalties involved? Not sure I understand the question. How do you handle
Sounds like
this?
a variable rate. Someone's asking about maybe a variable rate commission
All right.
compensation.
So how do you handle listing broker that varies when there is a buyer's agent? Well, I mean, there's no law. I mean, that's a good question. I mean, that's sort of where, again, sort of making it transactional and maybe just, not trying to write into an agreement where you're handling these sort of various scenarios where if it's sold in-house, it's blank, but if it's sold with a cooperating broker, it's Y, and but there used to be language that you had to disclose in the MLS if there's a varying rate of compensation, but that language was actually taken out as part of the settlement agreement. So there's no longer an obligation to disclose in MLS that situation.
It still exists in the code of ethics though, but what I would say is if you're talking about a variable rate compensation on the listing side, make sure justify it to the seller, not just like I want the whole thing because there's no one else involved. It's, are you performing, if there isn't a cooperating broker, are you performing extra services for the seller? Are you taking on greater liability? So don't just make sure and explain all of that to the seller, however you structure. I know we've had a few, I think some of these we answered, but I'll just mention in the MLS exclusive right to sell and the other listing agreements, there's a place that's sort of a right after the compensation section. I think it's section 7 in the exclusive right to sell. There's kind of an additional provisions relating to compensation. So anything special you want to do, some people have said, maybe I want to charge on the net instead of the gross. I mean, anything like that, variable rate, whatever you want to do, and the seller agrees to, there's room to put it there. And then the other quick question we had was, we talked a little bit about changing current listing agreements. If someone wants to do that. There are amendment forms for all the listing agreements. Those are new forms. So keep an eye out for those. It's a 1-page amendment form. And then you can change any part of the listing contract, whether it's compensation or something else.
So I'm scrolling to the bottom of the list because I feel like we've answered a lot of these questions.
Okay.
We're way behind. So I'm going in reverse order, but
We're down to 44 now. So,
oh my God. Will MLS send out a summary and FAQ of the rule changes, please? So I just dropped into the chat that page we talked about earlier, RIRealtors.org/CPR. That's where all that information lives. And we actually have some of the videos that we've done previously there as well. If the seller will offer compensation to cooperating agent, we as listing agents can write it in the listing agreement under additional professional services fee provision. Yes. Go ahead, Monica, if you see one you want. to read.
Yeah, no, this is kind of interesting one, this comment, relative to the question about the buyer agrees to the fee and doesn't have money at the time of closing. My suggestion would be to have within the buyer rep agreement, language that requires the buyer to pay the brokerage service fee at the time of signing the purchase and sales agreement. And that deposit could be held in an interest in a basically in an escrow account. If everyone agrees to it, I don't see why you couldn't do that.
Yeah.
Assuming that everyone agrees to it.
Right.
Does the buyer want to have, and that might go to like the idea of having a retainer. Some people will do it, some people won't want to do that. But do you want to have the buyer before you start showing umpteen houses to a buyer?
Well, here's the thing. So,
You
but
wanna
the
have them
question starts
provide a
off,
little
the question starts off saying that the buyer agrees to the fee and doesn't have the money at the time of closing.
They're trying to prevent that, I think.
Oh,
So what do you put in the?
I mean, so I guess you could, but the
contract?
question is, do they even have the money at the time of the signing of the P&S, right? Is obviously another variable, but I guess if they do, right, then you could.
I mean, that could be, a retainer that could be a
Yeah.
refundable retainer that's applied to the ultimate purchase, to the ultimate cost at closing. Anyway, okay, let's see.
So besides printing out the MLS sheet this morning, is there a form we should have signed for the current pending transactions? I mean, there was not a form, but I think Monica said it. I mean, you could certainly, reach out to the listing office or send an email just confirming the fact that, that we all both understand that, you're obligated to pay the compensation as offered in the MLS, and just sort of get an affirmation that way.
I'm gonna grab one out of order if you don't mind.
Yep.
A good amount of franchises are now eliminating buyer broker compensation as part of the listing agreement. I'm thinking this may be good practice since buyer broker should include the fee in the offer. It's only the net that matters to the seller, as you said before, John. The seller can make a buyer broker aware that they're open to concessions. Why confuse it all with the seller getting involved with setting buyer broker commission? This would make
Yeah.
it simple. And
I mean,
finally,
that's
I don't care. Wait, let me finish your last line. 'Cause this is,
Oh, sorry.
no, it's a good comment though.
Yeah.
I don't care what the seller is offering as long as it does not change the agreement with the buyer. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, that sort of goes to what we were talking about. It just echoes the sentiments that we, spoke to earlier. So that's great.
Yep, Department of Justice would be happy with that comment too. Okay, let's see. Are there any topics we have not? Sorry, we're down to 39 questions, but we only
Yeah,
have a few minutes left. So we're just
I
trying to
know.
see anything that's kind of a brand new topic.
Yeah, that's why I'm scrolling to
Yeah,
the
we
end,
did
because I
that
feel like we've
one.
answered a lot of these. Done. Is there an example somewhere showing wording for the listing agreement addendum we should be using? Yeah, I mean, the new listing agreement. So as Monica mentioned, and I put the link in the chat, that the RI Realtors /CPR is a link to all the forms, and you can see what language is in there in the new listing agreement, and you can use that language.
Yeah, oh, here's one. Let's do this one. Okay, this one is, if through the best efforts of a buyer's broker, the buyer refuses to sign a buyer's agreement, what are my options at that point? They still want to work with me, but are hesitant to sign anything. Do you want me to grab that one or?
Yeah, go ahead. I mean, right. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I understand what you're saying, that they don't want to sign anything, so maybe, I don't want to sound out of touch with this answer, but, would they sign something that were for, just one specific property? Would you limit the types of services that you provide, so it's not a huge amount that they're looking at, staring in their faces? And that was something John mentioned earlier, that we've seen a lot over the years on the listing side, a wide range of a menu approach to services. Is that something that people will be looking for on the buy side? Maybe, and I know I've said it before, but maybe, and some will disagree with me, of course, which you can, but is your value showing houses? If you've got a buyer you have to show 200 houses to, is that a good use of your time? I can't answer that question. That's up to you. but there are different ways to structure the compensation. But as far as like, I think this question also gets to penalties, like, do you go ahead, but the buyer won't sign anything? John talked about how MLS would police this, like we're not going around demanding, just as we don't do with listing contracts. The MLS staff doesn't demand that everyone hand in a copy of your listing contract. It's in response to a complaint or a random audit. So yeah, don't know if I've got better
So
answers.
there's two questions here that are sort of related. Can the buyer rep negotiate a lesser professional service fee than what is agreed to on the buyer rep agreement based on what the seller is willing to accept? Of course, right?
Yeah, and I think we had a question earlier, is that if that happens, is that something the broker needs to weigh in on? And that goes back to your office policies. Can you make that decision on your own, or do you need to check with your broker on that? And let's see. Oh, okay. I think let's do a couple more. Okay. So we've had some open house questions before. This is a slightly different take. But if I'm covering an open house for another agent or broker and an unagented buyer wants me to become their agent to make an offer, how to proceed? What I would say is I would go back in time and see when you're covering that open house. Sometimes people cover an open house like full well that you're actually acting as a transaction facilitator for the seller. And then, so that frees you up to become a buyer's rep or work direct, sign up a buyer who comes in. So it's really going to depend on what were the expectations when you covered that open house. Did the seller think and the listing broker think that you were there acting in the seller's best interest, or were you there as kind of a neutral? So once you figure that out, then you can decide, all right, can I sign up this buyer as a buyer's rep if they want to make an offer on this property? Or am I a transaction facilitator? So.
Well, Monica, I think we're over time, 11:31. We've been pretty generous, unless you see a question that we haven't addressed yet. It looks like most of the outstanding questions are kind of repeat questions that probably came in.
Maybe there's one. And by the way, those of you who were skipping over your question, we're not saying your questions aren't good. Some of them I think we've handled before. If we miss a new topic, then it's not intentional. I think I just saw a comment, now I'm trying to find it, but it was, okay. I do want to address this because I think a lot of people feel this way. And this is more of a comment than a question, but sometimes solidarity is helpful to have. I'm still trying to understand if all of us have been breaking the law and we are now being punished and are under probation until November by the Department of Justice. If only a few bad brokers, quote unquote, broke the law and we are all paying a price for this, am I on the defense or offense when I bring this up with a client? I really don't feel that I have to deserve to go through all of this. I have done my best for over 20 years and I have not cheated or mistreated anyone. Yeah,
Well, yeah.
I just wanted to end, and we can make quick final comments, but I just wanted to share that with everyone because I've certainly been getting a lot of calls and comments like that. I know John has heard them too. Yeah, initially, I think if it weren't for the copycat lawsuits, I remember when the judgment came down in the Missouri case, that nearly $5.4 billion with a B dollar judgment. At the time, I was writing an antitrust class, and when I gave presentations, we're kind of focused on like, okay, this is what they did there, but in Rhode Island, we're transparent on our listing contracts. I think John mentioned this earlier. Our listing contracts broke out. It didn't just show one lump sum of compensation. It broke it out. What's the total compensation? What's being offered to a cooperating broker? They didn't do that in the cases in the MLSs in Missouri that were kind of involved in this lawsuit. There are other issues like that. There's bad behavior in different parts of the country. Not saying that Rhode Island's perfect, but then I think what the difference would happen is before we could say, people who weren't maybe doing things the right way versus people who were. But then once all these copycat lawsuits started being filed, and we're over 20 of those lawsuits that have been filed across the country, and you're looking at just the numbers to resolve the one case as $5.4 billion. Then it was kind of like, yeah, what price fighting? I mean, some of the national franchises and corporations were named as well. And like, do you drive the whole profession into bankruptcy? And I understand the feeling about sort of feeling there's this collective punishment. But sometimes, the legal system isn't perfect. There's a jury trial, and when you have more than 20, this stop the clock. And I know it can be frustrating and, maybe kind of scary for people, but all dealing with this. But I truly believe you're going to get through this, and we are definitely here to help you.